With the announcement of the Sage, the developers for Final Fantasy XIV stated that the special unique mechanics of the Sage would be, and I quote from their presentation slide, able to temporarily augment their own magic abilities. So I figured, honestly, why the heck not do a video just focusing on what ability augmenting abilities that we have seen in Final Fantasy XIV. Now the question is, can we have augmentception, where we have an ability that augments an ability that augments ability? Okay, maybe that's too silly, but I had to say it. But I want to cover what we have already seen in Final Fantasy XIV, either in the present game or in the past game during 1.0, and ponder over what is really plausible in the context of healers. This video in particular is going to be focused on augmentation abilities seen in version 1.0 of Final Fantasy XIV, and there are some very, very interesting potential candidates in here. I do want to say that I originally wanted to do all the augmentation skills in one video. Was not possible. It became a hour-long video. There are just way too many skills. But I really do think that this is going to be a topic that I think a lot of people are going to find quite interesting. After all, as I've explored in my past videos, many times we have seen abilities come directly from 1.0 days into newer content, and if it isn't just directly the ability, then it is at least the theme or some mechanics of that ability that we have seen come in some form. So I do think that there is a lot to be gained from delving into this discussion, and for the sake of sanity and brevity, I am going to be focusing on the abilities in this video that augment magic abilities, although in the series some Disciple of War abilities that I find extremely plausible I am actually going to be bringing up too. Just a quick moment before I get into the skills is that if you want to help support me and my content, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered augmenting my like button with a thumbs up, and dropping a thick cat daddying on that subscribe button. But augmenting abilities, I should say, have been around since the days of Eld in 1.0. In fact, there are so many examples of augmenting abilities that the original idea of doing one video was absolutely bonkers, and I'm breaking this video up into separate videos. So let's start with the skills from the Conjurer and White Mage of 1.0. Trance Chant is an interesting ability that I think is worth starting off with because I think that this will give some flavor to the video. Right now, I'd say that Trance Chant is a great example of an ability that came from 1.0 that got turned into the ability of Surecast that we know and love today. But let's talk more interesting things, more sagely things, like Profundity. This ability makes it so that your cast time and global cooldown timer is longer, but through doing that makes your damage potency significantly higher. This is actually one of the most probable abilities in my mind for Sage Augmentation skill. I say this as a Sage is a barrier type healer, and that allows them to mitigate damage and prevent it, and really build up ahead of time to get some space to breathe later. And this gives the Sage a way to further enhance their damage at the cost of slowing themselves down to a crawl. It really seems plausible in the context of mitigation and barriers. I do want to cite though that in my previous video talking about the Sage origins, that the Gundam universe did come very much into play in my mind, and that in the Gundam universe there is a so-called variable speed beam rifle. See what I said about some of these dots connecting? To me, this seems like a very probable skill set that we might see in 6.0. Next up is the ability Radiance, which stands out as a potential way to regenerate MP for the Sage. To me, this does sound super similar to Energy Drain if we just take this at face value, but what if we kind of take it and we make it so that we can have a temporary augmentation to our basic fire, where now it's going to slowly, for each damage ability we do, give us like 5% of our MP back based upon whatever the damage is that we deal. So this in the Gundam universe actually also does have a parallel. We were talking about a generative beam rifle device, which basically there is a generator on board of those particular beam weapons that would slowly allow them to recover. And in the context of Final Fantasy XIV with an Aether Waving Sage, this means that it would replenish and regenerate Aether stores, or MP to be particular for the Sage. Spiritbind is the next ability, and it reduces MP consumption. Very similar to Generative Beam Rifle that we just spoke about, this is going to basically make it so that Sage has more MP to really deal with, which I do honestly see in the context and world of current day Final Fantasy XIV, this being a potential better candidate than the last ability for something to restore MP, or rather to prevent MP expense. It would be kind of something like Thin Air that we see for the White Mage today that reduces all MP costs to 0, but a little bit different, where it might last a little longer, it might just be something that you could switch on. And I also do think that this would be a healthier representation of the ability, because what we do see in current gameplay is that we have the ability Lucid Dreaming, where your Lucid Dreaming is gradually going to restore your MP. And I don't know if the developers would really want to double down on having two separate MP regeneration abilities, but as we have seen in the White Mage, we have seen MP reduction skill alongside Lucid Dreaming. Mind you, Aether Flow and Energy Drain are a thing. Still, to me, this seems more probable. Next up is Soughspeak, which reduces Enmity and Magic Potency to balance it out. Which, if you're reducing Magic Potency, so less damage dealt, aren't you just going to generate less Enmity in general? But honestly, if I'm being super serious, I don't see Enmity abilities like this coming back to Final Fantasy XIV unless Enmity is changed again. Resonance is an interesting ability that I really think is worth talking about, where it reduces the actual area of effect of an ability, like Medica 2, which is a much bigger radius, into a tiny Cure 3, which has a very tiny radius. But it would let you fire longer distances. But, and it's a very big Nicki Minaj size, but if I am being totally honest, I would be extremely surprised if this came back to 14 for the Sage. While I think it is actually so bamf, I can't say that fully out loud, can I? But I think it's totally bamf to imagine a sniper-esque Sage playstyle with the new list just pew 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 from like a billion miles away. I do think that this is actually totally out in left field for the current context of the game and what content we are actually seeing players take part in. And I don't see any fights demanding that sort of range. Next up is Fastcast, which I think is a fascinating ability. No doubt this ability is the father to the beloved White Mage DPS cooldown, Presence of Mind. Don't tell me you're using it as a healing cooldown. I still don't buy it. I saw the comments, I still don't buy it as a DPS cooldown. But do I think that we could see something like Fastcast for the Sage? And I actually do, but not in the same form as Presence of Mind. What we could see instead is that Fastcast would act in the reverse of Profundity, where Profundity lengthened the cast times and global cooldown, but increased the damage potency. In the trailer, we did see exceedingly fast gun movements, but then in the job skill showcase, we also saw a slower cast time beam ability, meaning that this could be an optional toggleable mode and optional augmentation that the Sage could flip on that would let them lower their cast time. And I'm thinking something like the Astrologian currently has Malefic at a cast time of 1.5 seconds, which with the current baseline 2.5 second global cooldown opens a 1 second global cooldown window in gameplay. I'm going to cite again from the Gundam universe that we have the variable speed beam rifle, and because it's variable speed, we can either go slower with something like Profundity, or we can go faster with something like Fastcast, really allowing the Sage to truly augment their basic fire to either be long, powerful beams, or fast and lighter striking beams. Roaming Soul is the next ability, and it lengthens the effect of the next spell cast. And honestly, in a world where barrier healers and pure healers exist and are going to be a reinforced archetypes for 6.0, I am not confident that the Sage will get a damage over time effect or heal over time effect. We don't know yet, but it's not a bet that I'm really willing to go either way. I think that it's like a 50-50 split. But I do think that this would be something, in particular Roaming Soul with the extension effect, would be more appropriate on something like the Astrologian or on the White Mage. In fact, for the Astrologian, we've already seen a rendition of this ability, this Roaming Soul ability, where they could like extend the duration of their cards or their heal over time effects. In fact, it buffed both at the same time. But I don't see it for the Sage. Chainspell is the next ability, and it's a spell that I literally cannot recall the exact mechanics of, but going off of the tooltip here, it states that we repeat the incantation, reducing cast times, GCD, and cost. I think if we take this ability very literally and think about how we could tinker with it in the Sage Cool Kit. I think this ability is cool, okay? That was totally a Freudian slip. But in terms of this cool kit, it could be reworked into a system where the Sage could temporarily turn on a buff, where the Sage would get like a 4 stack of a buff that would be like a 4 revolver shot ability. So like basic ability 1 does normal damage and normal cast time. That same ability is cast faster. Then they can cast it a 3rd time even faster, and then the 4th time even faster. And I only say 4 because we literally have 4 newliths, and so it would let the Sage have something like a 60-second cooldown to burst down a target, like 4 slots in a revolver, like But when you think of a barrier healer, or at least when I do, I think about like preventing damage and trying to open windows where they can attack, like really leveraging the barrier playstyle. I personally do think that it would be extremely cool to see this, especially when we're talking about a 8-player raid setting where you have those buff windows for the party with multiplicative stacking buffs. I think it would be absolutely bamf to have a healer just go and like put on like a 60-second cooldown. Just thinking back to like the Machinist where it has reassemble on a 60-second cooldown, it would be really cool to see something like Chainspell where you fire off and just like take advantage of like it being a unique barrier healer. Like I could love Chainspell if they did something like that. The last 1.0 white mage ability was One with Nature, and it increased the affinity with conjurer based actions by 10 to maximum of 100. Honestly, if I'm being super honest, I don't ever see this coming back to Final Fantasy XIV, even if it was adapted for the Sage. Baseline stat improvements like this have been largely pruned from 14 over the years and don't really promote active gameplay, so I don't really miss it myself. So now let's get into the 1.20 skills. Sacred Prism lengthens the cast time on an ability, but lets it impact multiple targets. Thinking of it from a barrier perspective, it could be like an easier to deploy deployment tactics that could help mitigate significant party damage if you had a big barrier on one person, like what used to be a crit low, and they just spread it around the team. That could be huge mitigation. Or alternatively, if the Sage was given a super powerful single target ability, we could use it alongside Sacred Prism for massive AoE damage, like just bathing the field in it. And I do actually see this ability as a very likely candidate to see in 6.0. It also works very well with the Charlian lore at them being adept at manipulating Aether, and so why not take one spell's Aether and just spread it around. The next ability is Cleric Stance, and we're going to talk about it for a little because I genuinely do see Cleric Stance coming back in some form for the Sage. And so Cleric Stance, for a lot of you who've been keeping up with these video series, you know that this has been talked about plenty of times on this channel, because in the past it has been such an iconic ability to healers. So Cleric Stance in the past was truly the ability that let healers contribute to DPS during their downtime. Once upon a time, the primary stats Mind only increased healing, and only healing. And Intelligence only increased damage, and it increased damage even for healers. So this has long since changed, as everyone knows. We don't swap Cleric Stance anymore on healers, but in my and many other people's opinion, that was actually a change for the better. I hope that I don't get cancelled for that, but I don't actually truly miss stance dancing too much. But what we used to do was that so-called stance dance, where we would swap Mind and Int over and over again in order to gain even more damage during our downtime. The problem is that this came at the cost of our healing potency being dramatically lowered when in Cleric Stance. Now this ability, when I think of the Sage in particular, I do think this is a very probable returning skill, and I'm actually happy for it. Which I know a lot of people are going to be like, wait, didn't you just say that you are glad stance dancing was gone? 100%, but I do think that it can come back in a more healthy, more rich form than it was in before. Like, let me go over like 3 quick points of why I think that the Sage will be really healthy for it. So firstly, I say this because the Sage is a barrier type healer. It's mitigating future damage and being more preemptive rather than reactive, proactive rather than reactive. And proactive versus reactive are terms very often used and coined in World of Warcraft for things like the Discipline Priest, where you'd set up ahead of time before damage spike for a massive burst window of healing during damage. Secondly, because the barrier healer versus pure healer archetype has been stated to be pushed for 6.0 to diversify the healers. Sadly, this does mean that my fave healer, the Nocturnal Ast, is going the way of Diadem, and yes, I am still 100% sad over that. I don't know if I'm going to get over it anytime soon. I'm really kind of regretting it. Oh my god, I'm really worried about 6.0. Thirdly, because one thing that the Scholar did in the past, and I really did think it made a lot of people mad back in the days of Cleric Stance, was that the Scholar's Fairy was not impacted by Cleric Stance. The Fairy kept its massive healing potency in spite of the Cleric Stance existing on the Scholar. And I should say this because I know a lot of people have been playing in the Bojan Southern Front and they have been using lost actions like the Profane. I should say, Scholar, when you are using Essence of the Profane, will lower the Fairy's damage, so it's not a technical limitation, but at the time, it was, in my opinion, a design decision to let the fairy continue doing that. But my point in really saying that is that the Scholar could circumvent the Cleric stance healing debuff with the fairy and still do good healing with Eos or Selene while doing good DPS with Cleric stance's buff. Sage does not have a fairy. 4 floating newliths does not a fairy make, meaning that there would be no realistic way to cheat out the Cleric stance debuff. You can apply barriers and mitigation, but no, my friend, you cannot have your DPS cake and heal cake too. And so I think that that is a much healthier way of Cleric stance existing that is fair to, I believe, everyone. Because there's just no cheating. It's just like, if you have Cleric stance on, you will be impacted by it in your healing. Period. So one thing I do want to say, though, is that this original 1.0 tooltip says that it increased the potency of attack spells by 20% and reduces healing potency by 20%. If I'm being honest, and these number values should likewise change, like maybe lower the healing potency by like 70% or 50%, like make it more significant. But being honest, I do think that the original 1.0 rendition of Cleric Stance really would be similar to how we would see it come back for the Sage toolkit. Like, we can see, like, its original cooldown was like 30 seconds. Okay, what if you made it like 90 seconds? It's still a very solid damage increase and a very good trade-off, though. And one thing I should say is that I would also add to, like, for balancing purposes, like a 15-second duration on it. So like 90-second cooldown, 50 seconds duration. I mean, 15 seconds, 50, my god. 15 seconds duration. I think that that's pretty fair. So you are able to keep it up. You are able to line with like half of the 60-second windows, because it goes, your first one is popped right at the start of the raid buff window. Okay, then you have like 60 seconds. Then you wait an extra 30 seconds. Then you get it. And then you're off alignment of minute cycles. But then the next time you're going to be back on it. So I think that that would be fair and balanced, seeing 90-second cooldown with a 15-second duration. But also, talking about the 1.0 tooltip, is that this is a very clear tooltip that would survive in today's Final Fantasy XIV climate, where mind and int swapping has long been removed, and like I talk about it, and then I get a lot of people, which is totally fair, going, whoa, mind and int, like I never even thought about these things. And I'm like, yeah, of course you wouldn't. Like, this hasn't been a mechanic for years. Now let's talk about the 1.0 Black Mage skills. And so Blood Rite would deal damage to the caster for more damage dealt to targets. I think that this is an interesting mechanic, but when I think of the Sage and Barrier healers, I'm not sure that this fits. In fact, we have seen a similar idea as Blood Rite in the Dragoon's old buff ability of Blood for Blood, where you would gain damage, but you would take increased damage, and likewise, the damage increase component of Blood for Blood was completely removed. In fact, I'm pretty sure it goes under a different name now. It's the same color tooltip, though. It has like the same icon, but they changed it to something else. It used to be Blood for Blood. I'm gonna probably forever call it Blood for Blood, just because it was what it was back in the day. But getting back to the point, I do think that if we were talking about a damage boost for the Sage, it would be much more likely to be like that modified Cleric stance, or much more likely to be something like Profundity, where you are toggling a skill augmentation, you're lengthening cast times. I don't really see the Blood Rite ability where you're damaging yourself for higher potency being a thing, because it's just like, let's say you're in a raid scenario. Now you're expecting your White Mage or Astrologian Pure Healer to constantly keep a regen buff on you through the raid just so you can deal more potency? I see that causing a heck of a lot of salt. I actually hope Blood Rite doesn't come in, because the salt will be huge. Dark Seal would increase magic accuracy. Yeah, I hated stacking accuracy as a healer, and I haven't been avoiding talking it on my channel, but I'm just trying to shove it out of my conscience again. We're moving on from Dark Seal. No, please no. Next up is Firm Conviction, which is an interesting ability that I think would be really neat if we had like a World of Warcraft Holy Paladin melee-styled healer that was involved in taking damage or sharing part of their defenses with the team or the tank to mitigate off damage, meaning when you cast, you would also give the tank more mitigation. But for the Sage, with the 4 newliths, the 4 guns standing far, far away, No, I do not see this. It could be interesting, but if we're talking about a defensive cooldown, let's talk about defensive cooldowns for a little bit here. World of Warcraft has things like the Druid can go into bear form. The Druid can use bark skin, and this increases their defenses. These are personal defensive cooldowns, and are they useful in World of Warcraft? Absolutely. Do I think that they could have a place in Final Fantasy XIV? Absolutely. When you're having big raid-wide incoming damage, worrying less about yourself is always a nice thing, but this Firm Conviction ability in its current form I don't see coming forth for the Sage. Next up is Paradigm Shift, which is an ability that would increase the area of effect of abilities but reduce the range of abilities. And I think that this ability could actually see some potential in a future Sage. In fact, I could see it potentially in a White Mage. Such as you would be rewarding the healer for stacking up with the team to increase the radius of their abilities. Like, instead of shooting heals from afar, now you're close to your team, so you don't need the range, but now your radius of the heal that you get off is going to be good. Take, for instance, a White Mage that is casting Cure 3, and Cure 3 has a very tiny radius. Now, the Cure 3 spell would cast on top of that White Mage, so you don't need that range, but it would increase its pretty sad 6-yard radius all the way to something like 12, which would be bonkers, and all of a sudden you have an extremely powerful heal that can actually hit the entire team, and a cooldown to enable it. And if we had a barrier equivalent to Cure 3, like some kind of super short term but super strong barrier, that could be an absolutely crazy combo. Anyhow, there are all of the Black Mage and White Mage augmentation skills from 1.0, and honestly, I kind of feel like a fool for thinking that I could ever possibly cover all these augmentation skills in one video. Oh my god, but don't worry, I have fixed that. But I'm going to cut this right here for part 1, and more so coming in part 2, where I'm going to cover things like skills that we saw in A Realm Reborn, as well as current skills. It's going to be super cool, and I think that there are a lot of candidates that we should be looking at right now for the Sage. Anyhow, my question for you all now is, what do you think of all of these old augmentation skills? Are there any standout skills for you that you think that the Sage might have? As always, I'm just one person, and dude, I can easily be wrong. I can very easily be wrong. I am far from the authority. As always, I will be checking out the comments because I'm genuinely super curious what everyone else is thinking. I'm not gonna lie, I am actually fangirling over the Sage. I think it could be super cool to have a barrier healer like this in the game. It could be super cool. And as always, if you want to help support me in my content, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered augmenting my like button with a thumbs up. Yeah, and dropping a thick cat dandying on that subscribe button. Hey, that's all for this video. Take care and be safe.